And we're gonna run through the agenda quickly. I'm gonna start with a brief presentation about key RFP proposal requirements. We're then gonna go into your city work time, then industry experts Q&A. So we'll come back and we'll split into 2 rooms with the developers. So you have a little bit of a smaller chat and able to ask them about their thoughts on some of the questions that you come up with during your work session, proposal requirement, do's and don'ts. So just another reminder, we have the same 3 developers joining us as yesterday, Eric from Apex and Craig and Jared from Hecate. So they'll be around if you want them to jump into your work sessions, if you have specific questions, as well as we'll be on for a Q&A after. Great. So I wanted to start off by walking through the standard components that are usually included in a proposal. Cover letter, executive summary, plant description, a pricing proposal, financial and business experience summary, project team and experience overview, a section on co-benefits, an opportunity for developers to submit an alternative proposal and regulations around that, and then as well as some attachments or appendices. These are a lot of sections to cover, but some of them are more boilerplate than others. So we're going to talk through the 4 that I've just outlined in yellow specifically. So we're going to start with the plan description and timeline. This is outlining kind of the exact project details that you are interested in seeing. And I think I want to highlight that it's not just laying out what you want, it also reminds the developer of your preferences, or specifically lays that out what scenarios you're interested in reviewing. So I'm going to walk through some of the major things to include, and then what kind of details that your city or county should include in the description when asking for these sections. So the first one, the plan description. What you guys should put in there are any details that you're interested in on this kind of high level plan description besides size or technology. What we've seen from the RFP responses is usually this will be a pretty high level overview that states potential production, size or capacity, and then if it's wind or solar, or if they're offering multiple options. Second is location. Again, we've talked about this in kind of the scope of work and in the project overview section, but reiterating your restrictions or preferences around what ISO, state, or region you'd like the project to be in. What you get back is usually an address, a location, or a town, depending on where the project is. Development status. So this will vary depending on your city or county's timeline and what kind of project you're looking for. For example, the city of Charlotte, for their off-site RFP that they released last year, was aiming to be part of a Duke Energy Green Tariff program. And so they had very specific requirements on when the project had to be in place by in order to qualify for that program. They also, to apply for the program, you had to be at a certain stage in the interconnection process. So not everyone will have that strict of requirements. However, if you do have near-term renewable energy goals, you may want to kind of specify where in the development process you would like this project to be. And because if there's projects that are kind of in the pipeline, really early stages, that could take, a few years to get through. If there's projects that are already have interconnection agreements, they are going to be done sooner, which is potentially great. But if you are wary that your city council may take a long time, it also allows the developer to understand what kind of timeline you are looking for. What they'll usually respond with is where they are in the interconnection queue, any agreement, permitting that might take a long time, or things that they've already achieved. Development risks. So similar to the development status, this is really highlighting the outstanding documents or assessments that you want to know that they still have to go through. So really outlining what you're interested in seeing, whether it's an environmental site assessment, an LOI or a lease on the land, or an ownership of the land, any sort of insurance requirements. And then again, kind of interconnection, if there's still kind of interconnection or permitting that needs to be done, just understanding what the risks are to those development items. Plant schedule. So what you as a city or county should think about is earliest and latest acceptable construction start dates or commercial operation dates when the projects are actually going to be generating. Again, this is important if you are in some sort of program or working with your utility to sleeve a PPA, depending on their interest, and as well as any sort of renewable energy goals that you have. If you have a 2022 municipal renewable energy goal that you're hoping this project will help achieve, then that needs to be put in the RFP, just because developers will need to look at their pipeline and their projects and see what could be placed in service by that time. Renewable attributes. The REC preferences, if the city, we talked about this earlier, if the city will retire the RECs, should the developer retire on the city's behalf, or if the city's open to a REC swap, and they'll write that out. And then expected output, megawatt hour range, minimum or maximum requested, and then I'll walk through the attachments later, but an 8760 is usually included. The pricing proposal is obviously one of the most important aspects of an RFP. And so I want to walk through a few things that can help the developer streamline their pricing that they give you, and then you reviewing. So some of the factors that go into pricing are the term. It's often between 10 and 25 years, and some cities will ask for multiple scenarios, for example, 10-year term, 15-year term, and 20-year term. An escalator on the pricing. Are you interested, we talked a little bit about this yesterday, but are you interested in a flat rate, so it doesn't escalate at all, or are you interested in a 1% or a 2% escalator? REC options, these are really only applicable if you're open to swapping or selling the RECs to the developer, because that will impact your PPA price. If you're going to retain them or retire them directly, that should be noted, but it won't impact the different pricing scenarios. And then settlement preference. Understanding your appetite for basis risk, whether you want to settle at a hub or a node, which for a virtual PPA, many cities and corporations will like to settle at a hub since it's a little bit less risky. And understanding kind of what your appetite for these risks are will help the developer plan the risk into their pricing, because it will impact the PPA rate that they are able to offer depending on the risk that they have to take on. So this is a screenshot from the bid sheet that I'll walk through in a minute, but this is kind of what you can ask for, kind of a few different scenarios and different escalators that will lay out different PPA rates. And just one tip here, I know we've talked about pricing a few times, so I wanted to link the scenario, the section at the end of the day yesterday on scope of work, 2.1.5 in your template under project details. The pricing that you ask for in this section should match that. Co-benefits. So one of the things that we've spent a lot of time in the kind of overview and purpose sections is why else you're doing these projects besides the renewable energy benefits specifically. So this is an excerpt from the City of Charlotte's RFP, which in its proposal requirements essentially had a section that said, we want you to talk about the co-benefits, and we want you to describe the local or economic or community benefits resulting from the project implementation, and then listed a few examples of things they were looking for. So again, if this is an important part of your proposal and one, a thing that your council or mayor or someone who's approving it will be interested in seeing, then this is important to include. And again, we've talked about the co-benefits a few times, so I just wanted to highlight that these three sections, 2.2, 4.2, which is one we're talking about right now, and the evaluation criteria section, which we started on yesterday, that's all where these co-benefits should be mentioned, and they should generally be aligned throughout. So the attachments are not something that we're going to walk through in depth in this two-day workshop, but I wanted to highlight a few options, and all of the RFP examples, which we will have links for, you will likely have some sort of attachments or appendices, and you can usually find them. They're pretty generic. Sometimes we usually request a financial model so that the city or county can help understand what the pricing will look like over time. Sometimes there's a template for that. Usually people either provide a draft PPA or a draft term sheet that highlights the kind of most important terms to them. And that allows the developer to see what you're looking for, and then provide you a redlined copy back so they can actually go in and edit it or say, you know, this is something we need to discuss, or, you know, these are all fine. So that's sometimes helpful up front. A city energy profile for cities that are kind of are more open to different types of projects. This is important. I think the city of Philadelphia included one that was a pretty detailed kind of historical hourly look at their energy. And if you're in a retail state that you might want to get physical delivery of the energy, this is more important than if you're looking for a virtual agreement. City legal or general services forms. I think talking to people on your procurement team, they'll probably know more about this than I do, but most of the PPAs we've seen have a kind of a few pages of just general legal forms. Some cities have like 2 or 3 forms the developers have to sign. So just noting that you should talk to your procurement team about that. And last, an Excel-based RFP bid sheet. We've seen people kind of continuing to include these as a way just to make sure that there's a standard format for developers to respond for some of the more data-driven elements. And I'm actually going to share that on my screen. We've created a pretty high-level template based on one that Charlotte had used that we helped them create last year. Can you guys see my Excel?
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. Is that an okay zoom size?
Maybe a little bit larger.
Okay. So what we're looking at right now, it's only 3 tabs. It's pretty high level. This first one is pretty generic information, just contact information. So you can look at this sheet separately. This project info tab, worksheet number 2, is the project related. So again, it should have the project name if it has one, the capacity. These things in red are the things that you as a city or county need to update. So if there's a preference for solar or wind, write that here just so that they remember. If there's a preference for buying at the hub or the node, or settling at the hub or the node, again, write that here. And then what you'll usually get back is a latitude and longitude or a hub name. A rec options, like I mentioned, this is only important if you're interested in scenarios in which the developer can keep or swap the recs for you. If not, you can just outline that, but delete that section. And I wanna also talk about this blue box over here. This is just some instructions. It goes through a lot of the information that I just walked through, but you can read through it and then delete it before actually issuing. And lastly, this screenshot you saw before, you can lay out different baseline terms that you're interested in. If you are interested in having an escalator, so this one has no, and then 2 escalator options. And so you can kind of build out those scenarios that you're interested in there. And then lastly, a space for the developer to put in the hourly projected generation profile of the project. This is really important for virtual PPAs and any projects that will settle hourly. So if you're working with utility, that will give you an avoided cost payment. So last thing I wanted to highlight here before we move on to the next section is that while this looks really easy to kind of build out, 50 different scenarios, I'm sure the developers would echo the sentiment that only include scenarios that you're actually interested in pricing. There is someone on the developer side who's actually going to go through and update their financial model and rerun it for every single scenario that's requested. And so if there are some that are not, that you're just throwing in there because why not? I would just take a look at what is most important to you and really request the most important scenarios so that they can put most of their effort into the ones that they know mean the most to you. So I'm gonna end there, Q&A with the different developers. So first, I just wanted to give you guys 2 or 3 minutes to use the annotation text tool to type some of the questions that you have below.
So, but feel free to ask any questions you have after you put the question on this slide. But we can start from the question that has most stamps next to it. And we will ask Eric from Epic Clean Energy to answer those questions. So I see the question next to the gigantic arrow. Does a project need to be fully subscribed for it to be proceed?
Sure, yeah. So for this one, this has been an evolving piece in the market. Traditionally, a project had to have 100% offtake secured, and the offtake needed to be for a longer term, so 20 years was standard. Increasingly, there are investors in the market that have, they would like a higher rate of return on their investment, and so they're willing to operate the project with a portion of it being merchant from the beginning of its operations. And so we recently did a very large project in Texas called Aviator Wind. It's the largest wind farm in the United States, built as a single phase. It's 525 megawatts. In any case, 105 of that, so about 20% or so, was operated merchant. So the project owner will sell power directly into the market, take those revenues, they'll sell the RECs directly in the market and take those revenues and go at risk for the value of those rather than contracting. So generally the percentage of split is you need to have about 80 to 85% covered to secure financing.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, thank you, Eric. Another question I saw is on the top left. What terms do cities put in projects that developers find most problematic? So we already asked many questions about what to do to write a good RFP, but we also want to hear more about some don'ts in writing RFPs. So what's your opinion about this question?
This is one that sometimes can be just fine, but sometimes can cause issues. Would be requirement of a binding offers, or offers that require a bid bond or a posting of security. And if you fail to deliver if you're selected in the RFP and you fail to deliver, then the city or the entity can sweep the money. That's a pretty high bar for entry, and it really limits how competitive we can offer pricing in a lot of cases, because if we really have to be 100% sure that everything is going to work and there will not be any chance of a risk to us, then the pricing will likely be higher. Or our ability to offer many projects or offer projects in multiple processes might be reduced. So that's one that comes to mind. I think another one is, maybe like we were talking in the other room while you all were in your small group around leasing terms. There's sometimes cases where a project is taking on a lease with the off-taker itself, like if it's your city land. And if your leasing terms are 20 years, but the project is a 30-year asset, and that's a requirement, then it means that it's really challenging for us to secure financing without a really high PPA price. So I think there's a number of things like that where you have good intentions, but it just has unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And earlier you mentioned binding bids versus non-binding bids, and there's a related question on our slide, the text in pink. So what do you think of the pros and cons of binding bids versus non-binding bids in a price proposal part?
Yeah, again, I think sometimes that can be fine. We offer binding bids from time to time. But what's pretty common is that you'll issue your RFP and let's say the timeline is it's out there for 1 to 2 months for developers to respond, and then you evaluate those responses for several weeks, and then you come back and maybe request additional diligence or shortlist a number of projects, and then finally you select one. Well, over the course of those weeks or potentially months, a lot can change. We can get additional good news on projects or bad news. And so if you're asking us for a binding bid up front that doesn't have the ability to adjust upon selection or negotiation of the contract, it means that we have to take on more risk, and so likely the pricing will be less competitive. On the other hand, the good thing about a binding bid is that you can lock in to whatever the offers are at that moment in time. If you expect as the off-taker that prices are going up in the market, or that there's not a large supply of available projects, you may want to secure those bids now and have a penalty for people who can't support those bids over the course of your negotiation. So I think with certain limitations and articulating why you're looking for a binding bid is really helpful.
Perfect. And another question related to pricing is, if longer PPA term usually means lower price?
It doesn't necessarily mean that. I guess it might be helpful to talk for just a quick second about the different types of project owners that are in this market. And so there are more traditional deregulated arms of utilities that purchase assets from renewable developers. There's also more financial investors, and those are looking for a higher rate of return than the utility investor. And then finally, there's an infrastructure investor, and that would be things like a pension fund, like Canadian pension funds, European pension funds do a lot of project purchases or fund, some level of developers themselves. And so they all have a different profile of what it is they're looking for. Pension fund has to pay a low return to its pension holders, and so they're going to look for a longer term PPA, and they're going to probably have a lower price in mind for that type of a product. If it's something more of like a financial investor, like a part of a bank that's doing a deal, Goldman Sachs is very active in the market. They probably want something that is a shorter term PPA, and they probably want it to be a slightly higher price. So there's a dynamic here about who's going to own your project and what are the investment requirements that type of investor has, and how much do they value term, or i.e. length of the contract, versus exposure to the merchant revenues once the contract is expired.
Awesome, thank you, Eric. Another question that has a heart next to it is, how many term options, length options are too many to ask for? If I was writing the RFP that I had to respond to, I would probably say, ask for the option that you want, that you're most likely to transact on, and then ask for the best price. And so to me, that's the ideal way to gather, what am I looking for versus what is the market offering in the most efficient way. It is common to see 12, 15, and 20 for the term options. Increasingly, we don't see a lot of 20-year deals anymore. So 12 to 15 is the sweet spot that we transact pretty typically under. But if you have something else in mind, if you want an 8-year term, you can always throw that out there. But I think it's also worth allowing a developer to field an offer that they feel is going to provide the best risk to their project getting financing, and also offer the best competitive pricing to the off-taker. Thank you. And also another question, do you want to explain your question about the RFP sizing, the project size?
Sure. So we want to cover 100% of our electricity, but we're planning to also reduce operations with energy efficiency projects. So trying to think about the size limits, since it's so unpredictable, how do we address that in the RFP? And are there penalties if we reduce our load so much that we don't need the full amount?
That's interesting. Yeah, usually I hear that the opposite way, where a customer is expecting to build more load, and so they want to be able to grow over time or ramp into an agreement. There's no reason why necessarily that you couldn't ask for a decreasing amount annually or monthly or however you're thinking about it. So I guess I would think of it as, if you can predict where it's going to be over the long term, then I would try to do a ramp down. So 20 megawatts going down to 10 over 15 years. If that is problematic to predict, then you might also have like a range of output that you'll accept. And one way that I've seen that done is you're going to get everything that the project generates for this particular amount of the capacity. But if in an individual year we exceed a certain amount of production, then the project retains that amount. So you almost set like a cap. You'll never have to take too much. So that's another way to sort of limit over purchasing in years where it's particularly windy or sunny. And the last thing you can always do is that in the framework of a PPA, there will be a section called assignment, where you can assign your agreement to some other party down the line at any time. And that doesn't need to be the entirety of the agreement. It may be a portion of the agreement. And so another option you have is to say, well, I'm going to buy 20 megawatts now, but in 5 years, I realize I only need 15. So I'm going to make sure that that assignment clause allows me to transfer 5 megawatts out to someone else. And so you would basically be reselling the offtake to some other customer at that point, similar to us selling it to you now.
Interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. So that's all we have on this slide right now. I'm interested if anyone else have other questions for Eric.
Eric, I have a question for you. Without naming a developer that you may be familiar with in Blacksburg or in Virginia, when we were having conversations early on about potential PPA arrangements or PPA adjacent arrangements, it was very opaque to us how the risks that all parties were taking on and understanding those transparently, as well as how everyone was either being made whole or what the benefits were. In your experience, maybe you can just speak on behalf of your firm, how open are developers to really having a transparent conversation about everyone's risks and everyone's benefits?
Yeah, I think principally the notion of transparency is at least what we strive for. I think it doesn't make any sense for us to enter a long-term agreement with someone if they're going to be unhappy 3 or 4 years into that agreement. It's not like you're selecting a vendor to purchase a widget from. I mean, we sell a commodity technically, but these are infrastructure projects that are going to be, you have a reputation, and if your project is not run properly, that affects you negatively. Vice versa, if we mistreat our off-taker or sneak a commercial term in there that's really a gotcha, that's a long time to be in a bad relationship. So I think it's worthwhile to explore and be upfront and open about our concerns and your concerns, and kind of air them to make sure everybody goes into a contract eyes wide open. And that's easier said than done sometimes, because ultimately we're trying to manage a number of different project elements and risks and timing, and ultimately we have to deliver what we sign up for. So it's always to our advantage to have a longer period of time, to have a higher price, to make a better profit. And it's to your advantage to try to drive us to be efficient and lower price, more competitive. And I think that's the tension you want to be there, to be healthy in the transaction. But if there's elements that aren't getting discussed and or risks you don't understand, it's sort of incumbent upon the seller to make you understand what they are. And it's incumbent upon you to have enough resources that you can understand what to do with those risks and how to process through them. It's not necessarily my job to tell you don't take a risk. It's my job to tell you there is a risk and how do you want to proceed.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Eric. So any other questions related to proposal requirement or general RFP format requirements? Yeah, another question I have for Eric is that what's your advice on the format requirements in an RFP? I know usually cities and counties have different requirements on how to use, like how to respond to an RFP using a standard format. But what do you think of different formats, and what do you think are the best, not best, but like more ideal format or easier to respond format?
Yeah, one thought on that is that when we work on utility proposals, they tend to be much more stringent in their requirements. So there'll be requirements that we send them like a DVD or a CD plus a written binder, 3 copies of a binder, plus a thumb drive or a USB stick. And I'm just like, what are we doing, guys? Like, we have all this technology and we're trying to do something that is environmental in nature. Can we just do it online? And almost all of the cities and universities and corporate customers tend to be less formal in their processes. Now, they still have compliance requirements to meet their goals or to satisfy their purchasing requirements, but that doesn't have to be sort of in an outdated type of way. So I think digital is good. Excel is good. If it's a custom like procurement platform that is difficult to use or to have us use, like to put multiple bids in, it's just it's a hurdle that you don't want to be faced with if possible. So I like to present a PowerPoint or a PDF that's created from a PowerPoint as a way to describe the project visually and with the high points, as well as an Excel sheet that contains all the pricing information and technical details that make it easy for the off-taker to kind of get a full analysis without getting bogged down in too much narrative. So there's a number of ways people do it. There's no right way, there's no wrong way, but don't make us mail stuff in, and don't shut the deadline off at exactly 5 p.m. On a Friday, or else you're excluded. Because both of those things, when they're combined, can sometimes make for stress.
This is interesting because earlier in our previous workshop, we mentioned the possible impact of COVID-19 on the entire procurement process through PPAs. So I'm wondering, so what do you think some virtual components that the RFP procurement process can have, considering this difficult time?
Yeah, well, certainly, regardless of whether there's a limitation on in-person meetings or not, I think that the notion of some kind of an in-person or virtual video type of interaction between the two parties, it's always very valuable. What's typical that I see is you get down to a short list of 3 to 5 projects, and then you're invited to an in-person meeting, which would be 1 to 2 hours to review your proposal, present the project, allow lots of Q&A, and for the parties to get to know each other and hear about each other's goals and firm. So I think that is incredibly useful. Since we've been in this weird lockdown scenario, I've been taking a lot of Zoom calls that include video, even though historically they would have just been phone. We're just trying to be more visual to connect with people. So I think absolutely, one last piece on this is we are having to consider declaring force majeure on our ability to deliver some contracts right now because of this crisis. And one of the most common things that's causing us to consider that is that localities have shut down their in-person meetings, right? And so a lot of our permits require that we have a town hall and get public input. Well, if your government isn't allowed to have more than 10 people in the room, then how are you going to have a town hall and get that permit? It could be blowback on the city if they usher something through like this and don't adequately allow people time to give input. So we're worried that this whole scenario needs leadership at the municipal and county levels to figure out ways to meet and still get business done so that we don't, we're not delayed as an industry. We may be delayed on individual projects, but we don't want to build half the renewables next year because of this crisis. So that's kind of our take on it, is meet how you can and carry on.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Okay, we still have 1 minute left. Any final question for Eric? No matter it's about the procurement process or any other question related to the entire offsite PPA procurement process, or any other like format questions.
I have a quick question. If you don't have a project in the interconnect bidding queue, about how long would that take, or does that matter about the size that you're requiring?
Yeah, and it depends on which market you're in. Should I assume you're in Cook County? Is that Illinois?
Yes, PJM and
Yeah.
ComEd's utility.
Okay, PJM. So PJM takes a longer time to develop. I'll say all of the queue generally is very very clogged right now. So for PJM, it usually takes us like 7 years to develop a project there at scale. If you're 20 megawatts and smaller, it can be faster. I see I'm getting a 3-second warning here.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.